It's an unsettling feeling, not having control over something you normally should, putting one foot in front of the other, making sure a forkful of food hits the right face hole, the words that come out of your mouth, or won't. What a feeling that must be, to not be able to control one's own thoughts. Montgomery has more than its share of residents who are unable to think clearly for themselves. There are some who are able to tell you what that feels like. Most of them are able to only express that feeling with terrible screams or incomprehensible babbling. Some can only rhythmically spasm in their restraints in silence, or repeatedly bash their skulls against the padded walls. What of those who normally have the ability to control their own thoughts, but are unable to, or unwilling? I do not mean mind control by external forces, though that does indeed exist. I performed enough experiments in graduate school and have studied enough papers on the matter to know that it is most certainly possible to control another's mind, though it's not so magical or otherworldly as common folks believe. Everything's subliminal. For example, even simple, clearly placed advertisements can sway a person to purchase something they haven't even considered buying before. Having one's thoughts altered by others can most certainly be controlled. One just needs to become aware. Knowingly, unwillingly, controlling one's thoughts also exists. I was first presented with a case file numbered 16,962 27 months ago. The patient in question was being reassigned to me at the Montgomery Institute for Mental Health from another facility upstate. His previous doctor had taken ill and was forced to retire at the young age of 52. No other doctors were able or willing to make much progress with the boy, so into my caseload he was placed. The patient was 17 years old, diagnosed with severe depression and extreme negative tendencies. Diagnosis included the possibility of PTSD and anxiety disorder as well. Communication was minimal. The previous doctor assigned to that case had begun to make headway in that area just before it was reassigned to me. The doctor's session notes made an unexplained, curious change, referring to the patient as D, rather than his given name, Brian, once conversation had been established. Each ward at Montgomery was outfitted with the cameras for continuous patient monitoring. This was especially important in the case of D. His file contained several reports of suicide attempts. The circumstances of each occurrence, especially in their resultant failure, were admittedly peculiar. One case detailed an instance in which the patient had somehow obtained a large pair of surgical shears from a careless nurse. Though left unattended with the implement for over 6 hours, the patient was found merely badly bruised, with no lacerations of any kind. The patient had no legal guardian on file. His only living relative was a younger sister, 7 years old, then living with an adoptive family in Vermont. The children's birth parents were killed 3 years ago in an office building fire, where the two were co-workers. No grandparents, uncles, or aunts. My first session with the patient was, as I expected, rather uneventful. As he never exhibited violence towards others, there was no need for physical restraints. My usual course of action, in cases similar to his, was to merely begin our time together with introducing myself, leaving the nets open and completely up to the patient. I find this method quite effective at times, in coaxing an otherwise silent patient into opening up. It's reminiscent of a game of chicken, one might say. Who will flinch first? It may take many sessions, many days, weeks, or even months for results. I had years of practice and patience on my side. The orderlies led the patient into my private session room and seated him across in front of me. His appearance led me to believe he had not slept very well or very much at all, despite the Klonopin prescribed. His complexion was extremely pallid, though that's not at all unusual for most patients in mental facilities, as was pronounced insomnia-induced peripheral edema. "Hello, Brian," I said. "My name is Dr. Mason." In this particular case, I made the conscious decision not to address the patient with the name he had reportedly previously responded to, D. I felt I would resort to it when all else had failed. It also left an opening to later allow the patient to feel more empowered, in control. "Brian, I'm going to look after you while you're here at Montgomery. I want you to know that, unless I tell you otherwise, anything you say here, anything you do in this room, is just between you and me. I'm also not here to quiz you or to force you to say something you don't want to say. In fact, if you don't want to say anything at all, that's completely up to you. What is up to you, Brian, is what we talk about next. The next words, however long it takes, are yours to say." No verbal communication occurred in the ensuing 45 sessions over a 3-month period. Patient 16,962 was not the only Montgomery resident under my care at the time. My daily schedule usually consisted of private hour-long sessions with a total of 6 patients, along with the coordinated regular rounds of group therapy. Add to that the usual tedious paperwork and research, and the entirety of my days were property of my employer. The majority of my patients were very far and away different from Mr. Lake. Unlike him, most suffered from acute cases of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and debilitating depression. It was highly unlikely for therapy sessions to consist of silence. Case 14,732 was an example of a typical patient assigned to me. The patient, a 32-year-old woman, was rarely, if ever, able to be left alone with me. Afflicted with the advanced personality disorder and schizophrenia, she would routinely alternate symptoms of illness. Most times, she would require restraints or the presence of orderlies when meeting with me or with her visiting relatives, as she had a tendency to become unpredictably aggressive. Other times, she would switch to a state of catatonia, requiring newborn-like care by nurses, including manual feeding and movement solely via wheelchair. Often she would defecate and slumber against her will. In her case, and in several others like it, therapy had turned from various attempts at communication and towards more extreme measures, including ECT. In my 27 years at practicing as a psychiatric professional, my time at the Montgomery had proven to be the most trying. It's likely I would have benefited from visiting a therapist myself. One would think that someone in my profession would not have difficulty in finding a colleague suitable for the task. I choose instead to treat myself. Pride, most likely, maybe stubbornness. Admittedly, though it is conventional, temporary solution for some people, the choice of medicating myself with cheap over-the-counter liquid therapy was always ill-advised. On my 46th session with the case 16,162, something outside my normal protocol happened. I was first to break. It felt as a rather involuntary thing. Half an hour had passed, and for a moment, I'd found myself staring out of the room's south-facing window. Green Mare Airport lay beyond, just a few miles away. At Montgomery, we often place certain patients in the south-facing window wards. It had been found that observing the irregular comings and goings of flights in the distance had a calming effect for some of them. I wondered if in some way the patients envied the passengers in those planes. Go anywhere, anytime, freedom. Perhaps it allowed them to envision something not so imaginary, something real, or simply something not so drab as stark white walls. In some way, I, too, envied those sky-bound travelers. We sat in silence. My eyes followed a 737 bound westward, and I considered it for a long while. What did Brian, what did Dee think when he looked out at the airport from his room? Dee, I said again. My eyes this time shifting to the patient. Only expressionless mouth was visible from beneath the raven black hair that mopped over his face. There came, then, an unmistakable smirk. Just like every other time, he said, without raising his head. His mouth quickly returned to its usual thin, black line. Every other time, Brian? I asked. I found it somewhat difficult to remain unfazed by the sudden breakthrough. It's Dee, he said. Sorry, Dee. Can you elaborate what you meant when you said every other time? This time, Dee turned to face the airport. A quick whip of his hair shifted enough of the hair from his eyes, and I could now see them, striking and black. I followed his gaze as he turned to the window. In the distance, two large jets left from adjacent runways, then parted in different directions. I turned to regard the boy. He was not watching the planes, the airport, the land outside, or the sky. Instead, his eyes were pursed shut, his brow rent with bother. Is there something outside that troubles you, Dee? I asked. Though I was interested in learning what he meant, I knew I had to remain focused on the now. He creaked open his eyes and blinked. Super, he said, in almost a whisper. Sorry? I said. I looked it up once, he continued, as though he hadn't heard me. The word. It means very good, pleasant. Yes. I guess you could say that is the basic meaning of the word. Is there something about that word that bothers you, Dee? If someone has a superpower, and it's not very good or pleasant, it can hardly be considered super, can it? I silently berated myself for not having broken the silence myself sooner. Would the results have been different if I had? I made a note to do this to myself, at the same time thinking, don't lose him. Well, let's talk about that, Dee, I said, not looking up. Do you believe you have superpowers? I stopped writing and gestured to the window. The two planes had already passed our view, beyond its frame. Like maybe flying? Is that it? No response. So you're talking about a special ability then, I proceeded. One that does more harm than good. I believe you might call that a curse then. Do you believe you're cursed, Dee? He considered this for a moment. Maybe. I allowed a minute to pass, to gather our thoughts, before I spoke next. Do not lose him. Can you tell me? It hurts, he cut in. This ability? I asked. It hurts people, Dee? He shook his head slightly. Just me. Just me. A knock at the office door interrupted the ensuing silence, and our short connection seemed to melt away just as quickly as it had formed. Without awaiting any sort of acknowledgement, the orderly entered. It's time, doctor, announced the large man in white with disinterest. The two left, the orderly closing the door behind him. After weeks of trying to reach this boy, I felt that making so much progress in one session was cause for celebration. I invited the bottle of Knob Creek out of my bottom desk drawer to join the party, It was already more than half empty. I guess we've been finding excuses to celebrate lots of things together lately. More likely, my personal therapy session was becoming more extensive. Good morning, Dee. It was our next session 2 days later. Our game of silence had already ended, and I was intent on making good and full use of our hour together. Following our previous meeting, I found some time to perform some fieldwork regarding the case, as I did not have much to go on. I found my best course of action was to learn more about the parents' existing family, the younger sister, and some patients I had under my care. I've had success in making positive mental breakthroughs when a living family member can be brought to the surface, ideally in person. It was fortunate that the sister was still relevant. The latest documentation reported that she had been hospitalized from life-threatening diabetic hypoglycemia in the past year, though she had recovered intact. It was unfortunate in this case, though, that the sibling was no longer legally familiar to the patient, and having her new parents agree to a visit would likely be near impossible. "Where's Dr. Reed?" Dee asked. I was not sure how much the patient had been told about his previous doctor, Dr. Harold Reed. Reed had been caring for Dee for the past 5 years, since he had been admitted to care by state social services. Though he currently was no longer practicing psychiatry, I knew the doctor's sudden lack of presence may incite feelings of abandonment, which could lead to a severe derailing in our progress. "Dr. Reed, your last doctor, at the upstate facility? Have you been told anything?" "Not much," Dee said. "That he retired?" "Yes. Are you concerned for Dr. Reed?" "I don't know. I've really thought he was going to be with me for a lot longer." By his tone, I was hopeful, perhaps enraged, rather than displaying tones of anger, resentment, or betrayal. His felt more of concern for another. I said, "It sounds like you had a strong connection with Dr. Reed. It makes sense that you want to retain that. Is it that you feel betrayal?" "I thought he would keep talking to me," said Dee. "I thought I kept seeing him all the time. I thought he was going to help me." "He was. Helping me, I mean." Dee sat reflecting on this before speaking again. "No, I don't feel like Dr. Reed betrayed me. I thought too much about it. That's the real problem. That's always the problem." "Are you feeling that you maybe set unrealistic expectations?" I asked. Dee shifted uncomfortably in his chair and didn't answer. "For others?" I continued. "For yourself?" "Both, I guess. It's better for everyone that I think less of them. It's better that I think nothing at all. It works even better to expect the worst, always." To punctuate that last word, he lifted his head to face me. Though he made no move to clear the logs from his eyes, through them I could see his solemn stare completely. I stood and turned to the shelves of books behind me, not looking for anything in particular. I scanned each volume, shelf by shelf, always stacked one up to the next, by subject, by author, title, in order. Logical. Failure is what I felt then. Those in the profession of psychiatry are rarely uneasy in the face of the mental ill, and at that moment, that is precisely what I was, unease. I was able to comprehend severe mental disorders manifested as violent behavior, indecipherable verbiage, uncontrollable shrieking. This was something else, and it was the lack of my understanding that made it the most unnerving. I turned and eyed the bottom drawer of my desk. Sometimes it opened 4 times of uneasiness. Sometimes it eased my pain. Sometimes it diluted regret. Always, it was meant for me, alone. It was comforting to remember it was there, for later. "Tell me what you meant the last time we met," I said. easing back into my chair, feeling less unsettled. You said just like every other time, when it was I who spoke first, not you. The change of subject seemed to soften the overall air of the room, and Dee along with it. I was thinking, the night before, he started. I remember we were going to meet again the next morning. I was thinking about how I thought you'd never be first. The first to finally say something. And then I did say something, and that's happened before. Dee nodded, with Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed then spoke the name you prefer to go by, Dee. What do you think prompted that? The patient turned silent again, hair once again spilling down his forehead, obscuring his eyes. My uneasiness had since faded. Dee shrugged. Like I said, I thought he'd never break in and say something next, never my name. And then he did. And then you did. And why is Dee your name, not Brian? I asked. It's what Cassie used to call me, he said. Your sister. Why did Cassie call you Dee? I asked. It's from a joke, from when I was fighting with Mom. My mom, I mean, she would come down on me about school. One time, she called me a total effing failure, in front of Cassie. She actually said it like that, you know, the F, not the real word. And Cassie, she sort of stood up for me, said something like, he's not a total F, Mommy. He's maybe a D, like in school grades, you know. Once again, that unmistakable smirk. Yes, so you were close with your sister? I asked. Dee took a moment to answer. His response was enveloped in a thinly veiled air of suppressed longing. Can we talk about something else? Okay, I said, probably sounding a bit defeated. I wanted to talk about something that was happening at the last facility you were at. You were hurting yourself. Not enough. Alright, I said. Explain what you mean by that. I wanted to die, but it wasn't enough. You had the means to, I said, like with the shears. What stopped you? As if the answer to the question was being held by a sign floating just outside, Dee's attention was drawn again to the window. I kept focused on him, watching his face for a reaction despite the difficulty deciphering what was obscured by his righteous mob. I wanted it to end, he answered, not turning back. I pictured how it would happen. I'd find something sharp, and I would cut myself here. He pointed to his left wrist. I knew others had cut themselves there and died, he continued. I was just thinking about what it would be like. I could see a blade slicing through my skin, my blood shooting out first like a punctured balloon, and then flowing out like a stream. The orderlies, Dr. Reed, they find me, an empty body in a blood-red room. In my head, I saw the empty cart just outside the door. No scissors, because I knew there was no way the orderly would leave them on his cart, out in the open for anyone to grab. He'd notice them missing if I took them. I knew I'd never find something to do the job. But you did find something, I said. The shears on the cart, they were there. He nodded, and I'm still here. His face shot back to look at me. You don't get it. You don't get how it works. Like I said, it's a curse. I'm cursed. Dee, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice down if we're going to continue to be able to talk privately. Once the man outside hear yelling from either of us, this session is over. And then we might not be able to be in this room together without them again. Do you understand? Dee nodded and dropped his head, and the stress in his posture was clear. I wasn't sure if I was able to hide the fact that the uneasiness was paying me another visit. Two converging shadows darkened the frosted glass of the office door, reminded me that, though we were alone in the room, I was but a scream away from half a ton of protective muscle just outside to keep things as they are so abruptly called orderly. Good, I continued. Now, B, let me see if I understand what you're saying. I'm hearing that you believe you're cursed, and that this curse perhaps causes you to fail where you'd like to succeed in your attempt at your own life, in anticipating what others may say or do. D remained silent and motionless, his tension palpable. That seems to largely be the source of your discomfort. These feelings of negativity in always thinking the worst of people and situations. D's grave reply came through gritted teeth. I already told you, if I don't think that way, if I don't imagine bad things happening, bad things happen. It has to be this way. It doesn't have to be, D, I said. There is a choice. You can choose to not have these negative thoughts. You can choose differently, and we can help you. If you're having difficulty not having these thoughts, we can give you things to help. No! His hand seized my desk as he shot up from the chair. You can't do that! You don't understand. I don't have a choice. Either I take the hurt, or others will get hurt. That's the way it works. What were once shadows from outside the door had already materialized and entered the room, seizing the boy from where he stood. He did nothing to resist. I have to feel the pain, he let out before being led to the door. I slumped back in my chair as the reassuring click of the door once again impeded the agonizing sounds of the ill from entering. They were still there, I knew, though transformed into indistant baritones. I sometimes think like that, like D. At times I believe that any emotional pain I endure is what I deserve, that it's not fair for me to feel happy, and that I need to suffer in order for others to remain happy, or for them to achieve happiness. That feeling comes and goes. It's why I chose this profession, isn't it? To take on the pain of those I listen to, those I treat, to help release them towards a life of less misery. There are methods for coping with remaining unhappy. Mostly, though, I became indifferent, into not caring anymore whether I feel happy or not. Remaining unhappy on purpose, then, is of no importance. I pulled the script pad from my briefcase and filled it out for a round of Depralexamine for the patient. Clonopin was already proven inefficient. This new drug, though experimental, had already proven to be highly effective in emotional disorders, especially with increased levels of depression surrounding overall feelings of immense responsibility. It would certainly apply well where one had an extremely negative outlook on the world around them, as in this case. I slammed my briefcase closed, kicked shut the now empty desk drawer, and took the bottle of my own comforting source of detachment with me for the ride home. The next day before our next scheduled meeting, 3 days later, due to the weekend, I visited the patient. This is not something known to happen very often, though there are occasions when it's helpful or necessary. In this particular case, the nurses had reported that he had been refusing to take his daily medication all weekend, as specifically the Depralexamine. When set against the other unremarkable white pills, its distant reddish color was a dead giveaway to him that he was being given something new. Given our previous conversation, it did not take much for him to recognize what was happening, and that my treatment for his depression was now coming medically. It was a rough morning. I arrived later than my usual 8 a.m., and still not quite feeling myself. In my distracted, sleep-deprived haze, I'd run a red light and almost gotten into a serious T-boning accident with a UPS delivery van. That, I knew certainly would not lend well to my displaying a reassuring and calming appearance. I've wanted to confront T in his ward, but he was already awake and in the southern common area, seated at a table and drawing with crayons, the sun blazing through the easternly facing windows behind him, reflecting off the polished linoleum tile floor. My eyeballs were on fire. I squinted with some hope of relief, but it did not come. The patient didn't react when I reached the table. "Hello, D," I said. "May I sit down?" Not waiting his answer, I pulled a chair closer and sat. He continued to keep his attention on his artwork, and I didn't care at that moment to know what it was he was working on. "D, I understand you're refusing to take the new medication we're giving you." At that moment, I wasn't sure if I was more annoyed that I allowed myself to get in a state like this, clouded, aching, disoriented, or that the patient was being, to my assessment, unreasonably defiant. Likely the former was fueling the feelings on the latter. If we're going to be able to help you get well, D, you need to start with trusting people at Montgomery. Trusting me, you'll see that having a more positive outlook on others and the world around you can help make your life much more comfortable. I know that's what you want. It's what I want too. But I can't. Don't you understand? I can't. "What's stopping you, D?" I asked. "Help me understand what you think you need." "I need it to end." "And this can be done for you, D," I said. "You are not cursed. If you take the medication, you might see that it's something you can control. You can stop this." He stopped his drawing then and turned to look out the windows to his left. Just as he had done once before in my office, he closed his eyes tightly shut, as one might do attempting to recall a lost thought. It could have also been interpreted as an attempt at sensory blocking, and at that I felt as though I was losing. "Wouldn't you like to live here someday, Brian?" I asked. His eyes opened softly at the mention of his real name, giving me the reaction I'd hoped for and bringing his attention back to me. "I believe you could live a life outside of these stark walls," I continued, "away from people who are truly unable to ever leave a place like this, not because they are unwilling, as you are, but because they are truly unable to, or we're unable to allow them." As if on cue, a crash of falling chairs came from behind me. I turned to see an elderly patient had fallen sideways and began to convulse. His body fishtailed along the floor in his white and blue robe, his exposed genitals spilling under it, as his head occasionally smacked against a table leg. An orderly and 2 nurses ran over to tend to the patient, just as he had begun urinating on himself against his will. "Most of them may never get better," I said, still watching as the other patient was being looked after and redressed. "You're not like that. I know you know that too." "It doesn't matter," he said. "There's nothing out there for me." "There's your sister," I said. "My sister's not out there. She's dead." "Who told you that?" I asked. Nobody did. I just remembered it happening. She was sick. Diabetes." At that, he looked away, towards the windows again, instead of losing him again in intense thought, with an almost imperceivable smile surfacing from beyond his shadowed face. He muttered, "Of course." "I'm pretty sure she's fine, D," I said. "She's still with her new family. I can find out more if you like." Still consumed with whatever thoughts he had, he shook his head. "No, you don't need to." He slowly rose from the table, the crayon rolling off of his hand, artwork fluttering along with it to the floor. Almost programmatically, he walked over to the window behind him, facing green mirror. The sun was now less hazy, the sky clear, and it was more forgiving to my eyes. D's unmoving, darkened silhouette became defined by a backdrop of pure azure. "Don't you see? Don't you know why I know she's okay, Dr. Mason? Is it because you're finally willing to trust me? I asked. No. It's because I thought she wasn't okay. I thought she suffered, and I thought she died. I'm not sure I understand, I said. What I believe to be true, Dee said. Anything at all. What I see, what I imagine. Whatever I very clearly picture in my mind, in my dreams. None of it ever happens. The minute of silence that followed was broken by one of the nurses who've been tending to the elderly patient. Dr. Mason, she said, will be bringing your first patient to your room shortly. I turned in her direction and nodded. She followed the other nurse and the orderly out of the room as they assisted the now relaxed, epileptic patient from the common room. Take the medicine, Dee, I said. We'll talk again tomorrow. Something crunched beneath my foot as I stood to leave. Besides a broken brown crayon lay Dee's incomplete drawing. I angled my head to better see what he had been working on. On the page were shapes of what looked like vehicles colliding, in a mass of orange, yellow, and red. Lots of red, thick and smeared. Flecks of crayon white scattered about from its forceful application, drawn in pools beneath the two entangled cartoonish vehicles. One, a small blue car. The other, a van, unfinished and merely outlined in brown. In the darkness, my cell phone rang out in its obnoxious tone. My eyes resisted creaking open, crusted shut with the preceding night full of uneasiness. My throbbing had joined in as a cadence to the procession. Dr. Mason? The voice on the other end asked. This is Diane Wheelock. Diane was one of the nurses at Montgomery. It was seldom I got calls from nurses at home at all. Miss Wheelock? I asked. What is it? Dr. Mason, you better come down to the facility right now. You just better come see this. Is there something wrong? Can it wait until morning? It's one of your patients, she replied. He's missing. Now I was awake. Missing? Is he in the building somewhere? Who is it? It's patient 16,962, doctor, she said. Brian Lake. And no, I don't think he's in the building. We checked and we called the police. I was in my car within a couple of minutes. There was no need to get in clothes, as is often the case. I had never gotten undressed. It's strange to say that I arrived at Montgomery, a mental facility, to find it in a state of utter bedlam, but that's just how it was. The solitary road leading to the building was already barricaded from entry by state police, allowing me to enter only once I produced identification. What greeted me inside Montgomery, though, I could never have expected. No one could. Not since the facility was first constructed, and before any patients had ever resided there, had something like this occur before. Every single door, every ward, was wide open. Diane greeted me as I entered the south wing. Dr. Mason, thank you for coming in. What's going on, Diane? I asked. Where are all the patients? There's so many police. Have they all been let out? They haven't escaped, have they? Well, no, she said. They're still here. Most of them are sane. Most of them are saying they want to leave. Sorry? Sane? I asked. What do you mean? They're speaking? Yes. Who? All of them. I entered the southern wing and stopped at the entryway to the first ward. It, too, was wide open. The room was ordinarily occupied by patient number 14,732, Sally Trustman. The woman sitting upright on the bed inside, though was not the patient Sally Trustman. She visually resembled Sally Trustman, and only just that. Dr. Mason? Came from the woman on the bed. She was coherent, discernible. Though pain from a nearly sleepless night, My eyes became as white as bladders. This woman who previously done nothing but lay crumpled in bed, covered in bed sores, and in her own soiled garments, whose only method of communicating was through gross sounds, drooling and pounding her clenched fist on her thighs, was gone. In her place sat someone new and reborn, utterly and understandably disoriented and confused. It was the first thing Sally had said since coming to Montgomery 11 years ago. My case, number 14,732. Sally? How are you feeling? I asked. Dr. Mason? Sally repeated, her eyes darting between me and the nurse. Am I all better now? The hat I wore as I trained psychiatric was off at the moment. I fell to one knee next to Sally, perhaps genuflecting in a way. How? Why? Looking back to Mrs. Wheelock. She held a quivering hand to her mouth in an effort to suppress any emotion, though her glistening wet cheeks under bloodshot eyes were telltale enough. How did this happen? I asked to no one in particular. Perhaps I was simply asking myself. There came no answer. I stood then and walked past the nurse and into the hallway. Presently it occurred to me that the sound throughout the building was overall different. Gone were the cries of pain and suffering, of freakish moans and howls echoing down barren corridors. Replacing them were the sounds of joyous weeping and, most of all, sheer confusion. A crackle of a police radio interrupted the scene. Several doors down, a group of uniformed officers stood about with baffled looks that no doubt matched my own. Among them was what looked to be a detective or agent of some kind, taking notes and closely scrutinizing the doorway and the room beyond. It took a moment to remember that it was Brian Lake's room that they were investigating. The detective stopped taking notes and turned when he seemed to notice me in his periphery. Sir, are you Dr. Mason? The agent asked. Yes, that's me, I said, approaching the congregation. This here, Brian Lake, the agent said, eyeing over his small notepad. He's your patient, doctor. That's right. I am Agent Ricker, he said. Has anyone filled you in with what's going on yet? Not much, I said. Just that one of my patients, Brian, he's missing. Escaped, Ricker interjected. We're interrogating several of the guards on duty when it happened, but apparently every ward door was unlocked at some point in the night. It's a wonder he's the only one left. This is a mental hospital, am I right? Yes, I answered. What's happened to the others? They're not sick anymore, said Diane, approaching from behind us. She was barely able to get the words out, almost frantic, though from excitement and wonder, not fear. They're standing, walking around. They can speak. They're asking about their families, people they love. They're asking about when they can leave. My God, it's a miracle. The agent dismissed the nurse as though she was the one who was mentally ill. Perhaps we were all feeling a bit psychological impaired at that moment. I'm hoping you can take a look at something for me in here, Ricker said. He motioned me into the patient's room. Upon entering, the scene was, as usual with psychiatric wards, nondescript. In the darkened white-walled room sat a neatly made bed and nothing more. The darkened sky outside was intermittently broken by the flashing of blue and red lights from various law enforcement vehicles outside, joined by the yellowish glow of the airport on the horizon. It's over here, Doc, said the agent. I turned to face the opposite wall. Against it, on the floor, lay several crayons, most worn down to mere sleeveless knobs. Drawn upon the wall were several lines of text joined by various drawings. I read out loud the words written there. Tonight, the doomsayer dreamed. I saw nothing will change, so then all will be different. The ill here will stay sickened. Their doors forever closed. They remain on like the flights beyond the window, to and fro, safe and free. That they will never be. I saw me too. I saw a sad, a pathetic me. But I am right now happy. Always is never, never is always. I am happy now. Are you happy now? Upon reading the final word, my shadow upon the wall grew more defined, as the drawing sun lifted behind me and filtered through the window. Is it really morning already? I thought, pinching the space between my eyes. I focused in some drawings surrounding the text. People laying sick in beds, behind closed doors. A man with black hair frowning, reaching out to the hand of a small, unsmiling girl. Two large jets flying peacefully through the air, their contrails creating elaborate and beautiful loops as they flew apart from one another. Apart. What I thought had been the lights of the sun then disappeared, my shadows once again becoming outlined only with blue and red. The voices from the halls turned from cries of joy to shock and horror. The clatter of shoe heels rang out as police burst into sudden sprints down the hallway towards the building exits. The windows of every southern-facing room then rattled in their enclosures. Then a thundering sound of destruction as the shockwave from the two colliding planes reached Montgomery.